Hi everyone, welcome back to the course on Sociology of Media and Communication. So, today it is lecture number 9 and we are going to talk about advertisements. Well, in the previous few classes we were discussing print media and then television, which looked at two different kinds of media. Today, we will talk about advertisements, which is a very interesting way to understand the relationship between media, culture and society. So, first I am going to refer to this work by Judith Williamson called Decoding Advertisements, Ideology and Meaning in Advertising, which was written in 1978. Now, how do we understand advertisements? What is the significance of advertisements? Primarily what the first takeaway is that advertisements are socially and culturally embedded and they keep in mind the context in which they are being created. At the moment you will know that advertising is also a very lucrative kind of career opportunity, where people hire advertisers, copywriters, copy editors, etc., to create advertisements that can attract people to buy certain products. Now, the various components of advertisement not necessarily belong to one language or social discourse. This means that there could be a multitude of discourses at play when an advertisement is created. For instance, an advertisement of, let us say, private university, which claims that it is very highly ranked, offers excellent infrastructure, global educational facilities, faculty who have been globally trained, etc. It is trying to create a discourse of both the global and the national, where the national ambition to do well, have good education, is supplemented with the idea of also global prestige, faculty who have global training, etc. So, advertisements generally have a social cultural rule rooted in multiple kinds of social discourses. Advertisements provide a structure that is capable of transforming the language of objects. Primarily it means that there is an understanding of an object without the advertisement and an understanding which the advertisement introduces. The essence of advertising components of real life is used to speak a new language, and this language, its terms are mythical, where there is coincidence, there is color coordination. What this means, let me explain it a little. The essence of advertising is in primarily creating a flow, a sense, and you have a very short time, you do not have a lot of time, using coincidences, color coordinations to create something which becomes mythical. So, one of the functions of an advertisement is to create a differentiation which gives an image to the product, but is built on a system of differences. For instance, the image of the product is very crucial. So, for instance, if I say think of a toothpaste, many of us may end up thinking about several brands, but one of the most popular brand would also be Colgate, almost being synonymously used with toothpaste. That is also very correct and significant advertising, where the brand becomes synonymous with the product, but it is also rooted in a system of differences because the idea is to market it as a product which is new, market it as a product which is different, and market it and take it ahead beyond the products which are otherwise there. There is also an association of meaning transfer through advertisements, where two objects with the same meaning are produced, but then their different meanings are also shown. For instance, there could be an advertisement of a sanitary napkin which shows that this sanitary pad has better absorption quality. So, you should be using it in comparison to another one. In that case, again, the meaning that is socially produced using the advertisement as a form of media and communication is primarily that this is better than the other one. Now, what advertisements constitute is of a vast meta system where values from different arenas of life are made interchangeable. Meaning is created primarily through the usage of signs that we already know. Communication as a system of social is actually based on the idea that what I tell you is understood by another person. Communication does not make any sense if I am saying something and you do not understand it. For instance, if I say at the moment that I want to drink coffee, all of you will understand me. But if I say I want to drink kuhi, maybe only some of you will understand me, those who are familiar with the Japanese word for coffee, which is kuhi. Interestingly, what communication is rooted in is that understanding. So, if I am speaking in English or in a language that I and you both know, only then will we be able to make sense of each other. So, any advertisement, whether or not it is creative, has to be rooted in the signage system in which there is a possibility of understanding those signs. So, there cannot be hollow meanings by themselves, one needs to have social contextual meanings. What does this mean in the advertisement context? For instance, the changes in advertisements also reflect changes in social cultural conditions. There was an ad launched by Ariel, the detergent company, of how now when you are using the washing machine, it is not a gendered responsibility alone, but the responsibility of both men and women to use the washing machine. They had called the advertisement sharing the load in this case meaning the laundry load. This advertisement is rooted in a sign system which all of us are familiar with, as we know that household activities like washing clothes and laundry are associated with the gendered work of women. However, by creating an advertisement that promoted a sense of inversing the gendered responsibility and creating shared domestic responsibility, it was also using the kind of space that is available primarily because we can talk about ideas of gender at this moment. There is a possibility to talk about shared domestic work. So, the advertisement is part of that meta social cultural system and is rooted in the way that existing signs and people can understand the meaning that is being communicated. So, the techniques that are used in advertisements, the ideas, the feelings, the emotions that are used, these are socially and culturally contextual. So, for instance, when we have an advertisement of clothing in the Indian context, the models, the mannequins will be wearing clothes which majority of people can feel that they would want to be wearing. They would be targeted by using social cultural symbols which are very, very useful to understand one's daily kind of association. Now, the product in many ways actually takes over the reality on which it was first dependent for the meaning. This means that a successful advertisement generates a product where it no longer represents an abstract feeling or quality, but becomes very, very substantial. In many ways, advertisements also represent the idea of freedom, the idea of desire, and they invite us to create ourselves and identify ourselves with the products. So, when there is an ad generated of Lux as a soap and celebrities promote Lux, it creates a sense of a meaning amongst the public that they can also look like the celebrity who is using Lux to take their bath. Essentially, the advertisements are targeted towards generating specific kinds of emotions in consumers who will be able to basically feel at home in the way that they can sense what is being sold to them. Advertisers also know that when they have to talk about meaning, they have to think about advertising as an ideological apparatus where there is an ideology attached into the signs and signages that are being used. Advertisements enclose us more and more in a world that needs to be interpreted. It is a world of significance. Primarily what this means is that this is a world in which meanings have been made and one needs to decipher those meanings. So, the meanings are there, they are encoded, they are already present, but one needs to decode these meanings to understand the advertisement. I will use more examples to talk about why these meanings needed to be unearthed and how do we understand them. Let us now focus on this very interesting work called Shoveling Smoke, Advertising and Globalization in Contemporary India by William Mazzarella, which was published in 2003. Now, he presents an ethnographic study of global consumerism using Indian advertising business as the example, and he actually follows this debate around the concept of what Swadeshi means. In the 1990s, as we were discussing through the history of broadcasting and television, that a lot of foreign investors, foreign companies entered the Indian market. But this also generated a dilemma or that one could see that Indian brands had to compete with these foreign brands in a very, very globalized field. Now, what this also means is that there was a necessity to carve out a zone of professional autonomy where you would also have to compete with foreign brands, as well as you may have the possibility of having multinational clients. So, there is an emergence of a communication infrastructure enabling marketers to address a very global population. But this is also interesting that we require culturally appropriate messaging through advertisers to approach consumers even when the market is global. This is something which we discussed in both print and electronic media as well, that when we think about media, the attraction of media is that it is global, it is national, yet regional and local. So, the way in which the Hindi press as well as Hindi channels expanded their scope is primarily by targeting regional locations. Now, when we think about advertisements as well, advertisements are media products, commodities which also need to have all these flavors, but they are also never finished according to Mazzarella, because elements of advertisements are sources from an existing repertoire of resonances and meanings, something which we were discussing in terms of what Williamson says, that the way that we understand an advertisement, the way we decode it, it is rooted in the social cultural context of the person looking at the advertisement, watching it, and the advertisement continues to be made and remade throughout its public career. So, there are many advertisements which are revised and then they are relaunched considering the new social context. For instance, Hawkins, one of the most well known pressure cooker brands in India, has launched a series of ads of its pressure cooker over time, which depicts very beautifully the social changes that take place. So, one of the first ads actually focus on saving LPG, because at that time the concern was money. Why were you buying a pressure cooker, or why would somebody buy a pressure cooker is that it saves gas, and that was the advertisement trick. Gradually, it shifted to the modality of the pressure cooker and utensils, which were looking very beautiful. So, the customers also had an interest in how the utensil would look, how the pressure cooker would look. So, the possibility of attracting consumerist kind of customers. Then Hawkins moves on to advertisements about women cooking very interesting food items like pulao and halwa in the Hawkins pressure cooker, and their husbands' friends coming over, indicating how the social relations were changing. And lastly, one of the ads show a woman cooking food for her own friend group who visits. So, one also sees how the advertisement is able to capture the mood of the society. Now, Mazzarella argues that Indian advertising industries attempts to legitimize itself involves three areas of ambiguity. First is the question of what advertising actually did. Is it a neutral channel or does it add a value? Then is the question of time, which is that should we target immediate gratification or deferral when we think about advertisement, and the last is competitive consumption or social harmonization. Now, these are the three ambiguities that the advertising industry deals with. These mean that one is actually thinking about whether or not the advertisement should have a very competitive market, or should it bring or target homogeneous population. The role of the advertising industry in India has been actively tied to the family planning programs and questions of industrial progress. It has also played a vital link between manufacturers and consumers, and has been an indispensable aid to the developing economy. So, when we think about advertisements and advertising industry in India, for instance, when we think about the family planning program, advertisements have played a very crucial role in how the messaging of overpopulation as a burden for the nation's progress and development was communicated. It was also tied to how contraceptions were sold to population, especially in rural areas. So, there was an understanding that the advertisement, like television, initially had a developmental role to play. Now, in a way, the advertisements have mediated between the particular and the universal, the local with the national, and one sees transformation of desires into aspiration. The tension between the global and the local is something which advertisements have tried to also mediate. Advertisements have also been significant in understanding aspirations, ways in which Indian society has a thought about its own place and the way that communication is then generated. The last text and the last idea of this lecture is to look at the relationship between gender and advertisements, especially in the context of globalization, by using an essay by Maitri Chaudhary. Now, what she does is that she analyzes how Indian print advertisements reflect and shape gender images and public discourse and India's economic liberalization and globalization. What this means is that there is a shift in the public discourse due to globalization, and there is also a change in media from what would be the socialist ideals to individual achievement, personal kind of achievements, glamour, and then the rise of this new normative middle class. Learners, you will remember that we talked about the rise of the middle class in post-independent India, tied to colonial factors of Western education, etc. And this new middle class in the 1990s takes on a more normative role, where advertisements shape ideology, and there is a reinforcement of what the dominant ideology would be. What Chaudhary does is talk about representation of gender and how is gender represented in these print advertisements. So, if one looks at traditional images of Indian women, they have been generally portrayed to be chaste and demure, but also coexist with modern portrayals of successful independent women. Male images historically have been defined primarily less compared to women, who have been the focus of media. However, when we look at the new Indian men and women who are represented in these advertisements, one sees how new ideas of the global cosmopolitan Indian are reflected in these imageries. The man becomes a cosmopolitan entity, he is a body conscious professional, he takes care of his fitness, he focuses on his appearance and success. The woman is represented as body conscious too, aspirational, she focuses on beauty, fitness and modern lifestyle. One sees the impact of liberalization on this middle class identity, which is expanded, and one sees that there is an interest in becoming global yet remaining local in many ways. So, advertisements, particularly in the newspapers and magazines that Chaudhary analyzes, talk about promotion of health, fitness, youthful appearance, and shift towards ideas of individual self-care and body aesthetics. If you will remember, learners, we had talked about how print media had added different kinds of segments, and segmentation became a strategy associated with the media, that you had sections on fitness, sections on lifestyle, sections on food, and these new segments represented these new ideas of how the Indian man and the women were represented. They were depicted as representing cosmopolitan Indian identity, where they were westernized but also had traditional values and ideas attached. The ads depict male power as achievement oriented, whereas women would be seen as a mix of success, which is modern but also tradition. One can see that the advertisements in print media that Chaudhary analyzes talks about these contrasts between gender, which is also reflected in the advertisements, and it is connected to other forms of media as well, because in 1990s, if you see in the films, we have several changes where films like Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, released in the mid 90s, talks about an Indian who is global and cosmopolitan, but at the same time has very desi values, indigenous values. So, the idea is that you are ethnic and you are cosmopolitan, and advertisements reflect that. There is a contrast between the male and the female kind of bodies and portrayal, where the man is a complete man who displays strength and tenderness together, whereas modern Indian women are portrayed as ambitious, independent, but yet traditional. So, we have liberalization fostering individualism, new gender models emphasizing corporate success and individual empowerment. So, what is happening is that print media and advertisement together promote a narrative of modern, successful and self-reliant men and women. And this discourse often displaces traditional and marginalized groups, primarily because we are talking about individualism and consumerism. It's also interesting that we are talking about a country which embarked on a journey of modernity in context rooted in colonial history, post-independence policies, which were shaped by ideas of how, one's identity should be. So, interestingly, what the advertisements do is actually portray ideas of gender, portray ideas of the social, and create different ways in which we could think about the imagination of the Indian. Now, the purpose of this lecture on advertisements is to enable learners and me to think about the social and understand the interlinkages between a form of media and communication like advertisements and society. So, the idea that advertisements need social research to be designed, need people with social acumen to be targeting the right kind of target group, is again dependent on the fact that these advertisements need to be socially, culturally understood. Similarly, when we have objects in the advertisements apart from the people, the objects also signify certain meanings. For instance, the presence of a Mercedes-Benz car with an Indian man in an advertisement would mean that he has the purchasing power and the capital to buy that Mercedes-Benz, which means that the Mercedes-Benz as an object is attached to the kind of man, the kind of career and the kind of job that he has. Similarly, when an advertisement shows that an Indian woman who may be the boss at her workplace comes back to her husband and yet cooks food and does domestic chores, they are portrayed as women who do their modern workplace duties outside, but also their traditional duties home, in a way reinforcing women's secondary social position. At the same time, there would be ads which would critique these portrayals, like the Ariel ad which started this campaign called Sharing the Load, or several other ads which will show the woman as someone who is fairly independent and both the man and the women can take care of household activities. These ideas that advertisements present in a way are encoded within the society, and it depends on who the advertisers want to target and how they want to think about advertisements to actually primarily make the advertisement. Essentially, it is a form of media that is trying to communicate a message that the audience should understand. Thank you.